Hello everyone, and welcome to our book launch tonight. I am super excited to be here with you. We are here, of course, to launch Carl Phillips, Then the War, and selected poems from 2007 to 2020. Carl is here and he's going to read to us in a little while. I'm going to hand over very, very shortly, but I'm just going to do some quick housekeeping with you. So we're going to be together for about an hour this evening. I can see that you have found the chat already. Please keep getting your messages in there. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know what you think of the reading and the poems. Carl's going to read to us, as I say, and then later on he's going to have a conversation with Brandon Taylor, who we're also joined by. And towards the end of the event, there's going to be time for audience questions. So as well as finding the chat, please find the button called Q&A and get your questions lined up so that Brandon can put them to Carl later on in the event. While Carl is reading, I'm going to have the poems up on screen as a bit of a visual guide for you to follow along with. Just be aware that you're in control of the screen yourself. You can reconfigure it to suit your own needs. And throughout the event, if you have any technical problems, just pop them in the chat and we'll see what we can do to help you. I don't think there's any more technical stuff to talk about. I'm really pleased that we are joined also by Brandon Taylor, who I hope you've come across. He's published widely in loads of magazines, papers and online, and you should have come across his novel Real Life, which was really highly acclaimed and it was shortlisted for the Booker in the 2020. So go and check him out if you don't know his work. But I'm going to hand over to him. Thank you, Brandon.
Oh, thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here, especially talking to Carl Phillips, who is one of my favorite poets. His work means the world to me. So without further ado, I'll read a few introductory comments that I wrote for this evening. Carl Phillips is a poet of the shadowy localities that exist between parents and children, between lovers, between friends, between strangers, and between ourselves and the world. His subject is the relational, that ever unstable yoking of two selves that begets meaning, love, tenderness, violence. It is no wonder, then, that his poems often take on the shape of argument and dialogue, which is simply the relational in action. Phillips captures the heady sexual rush of revelation, which is an argument with the self, really. Desire, need, lust, love, pain, forgiveness, passion, and fear shift and alter in his poems, and in Phillips's hands are revealed to be mere shades of some primal hue. Call it truth. Carl Phillips is the author of 15 books of poetry, including the 2020 collection Pale Colors in a Tall Field from FSG, and a personal favorite of mine, Wild as the Wind. His many accolades and awards include the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, a Lambda Literary Award, an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, as well as the prestigious Academy of American Poets Prize. Please join me in welcoming the brilliant Carl Phillips for the launch of his first UK book, Then the War, and Selected Poems, 2007 to 2020.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was a terrific introduction, and it's so kind of you to take the time to spend time with the work and talk about it. I want to thank a number of people, besides Brandon, Jasmine, and Becky for all of their help with the production of this book, and Michael and John for taking it on in the first place, Andrew for the terrific cover, and I'm both thrilled and a little bit terrified to be doing this. And then I teach right after this, so who knows what state I'll be in. But anyway, I guess I'm going to assume you can hear me, and I'm going to begin with the opening poem in here, Invasive Species. Switchgrass, beachgrass, trespass, little song. Little song, years remastering truth, now begins its own truth. Little song, deep in the night. Not a wreath, more a crown. Little song, worn shyly. Past regret, little song. no weep remembering nor long for. Little song done with tears, though nowhere anyone not somehow hand in hand, little song still lonely, undaunted, unpersuaded. Persuasion a meadow once, violence the field, seeding itself with its own flower. For fist, little song. Up from the dragged lake of the singer's throat, little song, severed fist in the light turning. It shines in the light. All right, I'm going to read a poem called Anywhere Like Peace. And like magic, it appears on the screen when I do that. Why are you reading from a book then, Carl? I don't know, habit. Plus, I'm excited that I have this book. Anywhere Like Peace. He's unbuttoning his shirt. We've never met before. He says, last night he had a dream about me. A good dream, he tells me. A strong one, meaning I was strong. And that for the first time in years, apparently, he felt completely safe. To confuse closure with conclusion is nothing new, I at first want to say to him. But a shadow softness to his face brings out a softness in me that I don't show usually. It makes me want to lean hard into his chest instead, the part where the hair, faint still, as if still filling in, looks like two wings positioned where they shouldn't be, but on purpose, so that flight means for once not seeing the earth fall away, but the sky getting steadily closer. Let the body approach. Will I ever stop wanting more than what I've already got? I used to wonder, not realizing yet that's all ambition is finally. I thought humility would be a smaller thing, a quieter thing. It seems I was wrong about that too. I can't decide if it's just my being so much older now, or if it's always been true that winter foliage is the prettiest foliage. There's a band, I think they're still together in England, called the Charlatans. They used to be known as the Charlatans UK. And they have a song called And If I Fall. And that is the title of this next song, poem. And If I Fall. There's this cathedral in my head I keep making from cricket song and dying but rogue in spirit still bamboo. Not making, I keep imagining it as if that were the same thing as making, and as if making might bring it back somehow, the real cathedral. In anger, as in desire, it was everything, that cathedral. As if my body itself cathedral. I conduct my body with a cathedral's steadiness. I try to. I cathedral. In desire. In anger. Light enters a cathedral the way persuasion fills a body. Light enters a cathedral the way persuasion fills a body. Those last two lines sound the same, but you can see on the screen there's a little comma in the last one, slight difference. All right, I'm going to read a poem called Something to Believe in, and it has a reference to the Iliad, Homer's epic poem, but don't be afraid. You don't have to have read that, though I do recommend it. And I think that's it. I think that's all there is to say about it. Just writing something down here. Something to believe in. My two hunting dogs have names, but I rarely use them. As I go, they go. I lead, they follow. The blue-eyed one first, then the one who's coloring her coat, not her eyes, I sometimes call never again, oh, never this way henceforth. Hope, ambition, these are not their names, though the way they run might suggest otherwise. Like steam off night-soaked wooden fencing when the sun first hits it, they rise each morning at my command. Late in the Iliad, Priam, the king of Troy, predicts his own murder correctly, except it won't be by spear as he imagines, but by sword thrust. He can see his corpse, sees the dogs he's fed and trained so patiently, pulling the corpse apart. After that, he says, when they're full, they'll lie in the doorway. They'll lap my blood. I say, why shouldn't they? Everywhere, the same people who mistake obedience for loyalty think somehow loyalty weighs more than hunger, when it doesn't. At night, when it's time for bed, we sleep together, the three of us. Muscled animal, muscled animal, muscled animal. The dogs settle to either side of me, as if each were the slightly folded wing of a beast from fable, part power, part recognition. We breathe in a loose kind of unison. Our breathing ripples the way oblivion does, routinely, across history's face. I don't usually have much to say in between poems, but one thing I can say about that poem that I find amusing, my partner pointed out to me that we actually only have one hunting dog. So he wondered, like, have I been turned into a dog? What was that about? So I had to explain about imagination, transformation. Poetry isn't the transcription of reality, things like that. Things like that. All right, I'm going to read the title poem that's called Then the War. Then the War. They planted flowers because the house had many rooms and because they'd imagined a life in which cut flowers punctuate each room, as if each were a sentence, not just to be decorated, but to be given some discipline, with the most memorable sentences, like people, always slightly resist. Spit of land, rags of cloud rack, meanwhile, hawk's nest, winter nest, stamina as a form of faith, little cove that a life equals, what they meant, I think, by what they called the soul, twilight taking hold deep in the marshweed, in the Pachysandra, where the wind can't reach. Then the war. Then the field and the mounted police parading their proud-looking horses across it. Then the next morning's fog, the groundsman barely visible inside it, shadow-like, shade-like, grooming the field back to immaculateness. Then the curtains, billowing out from the lightless room toward the sea. Then the one without hair stroked the one who had some. They closed their eyes. If gently, hard to say how gently. Then the war was nothing that still bewildered them, if it ever had. Flipping pages here. This poem is called Foliage. Cage inside a whispering so deep that, and then just the two of us. And you calling it vulnerability. And me calling it rumor passing through suspicion's fingers. Ashweed, flickering halo of the boy I might really have been once. Tiger lilies beneath a storm blowing into, then out of character, then back again, as if seasonal. Summer now fall. But I know suspicion has no fingers. Vulnerability is just part of the trash that rumor leaves behind. Waited out long enough, the trash shifts. It always does. In that way, it's like memory lately. I'm the fist of instinct, cool, unstoppable. You're the dogwood's crucifix-laden branches. I'm the fist through the branches. You're the fist. I'm the branches. I don't even know what to say about that poem. It's a little spooky. This poem is called Musculature. The last dog I owned, or more humanely put, so I'm told, that I used to live with, she'd follow me everywhere. She died eventually. I put her down's more the truth. It is the truth. And now this dog that I mostly call Sovereignty, both for how sovereignty, like fascination, can be overrated, and for how long it's taken me just to half understand that. Pretty much my whole life. Mortality seemed an ignorable wilderness, like any other. The past seemed what occasionally it still does, a version of luck, when luck, as if inevitably, gets stripped away. What hope otherwise for suffering? When did honesty become so hard to step into and stay inside of? I'm not saying forever. I could last a fair time on a small while. Sovereignty sleeps hard beside me. I pass my hands down the full length of him, like a loose command through a summer garden. Let those plants that can do so lean away on their stems toward the sun. I do feel the need to say that my dog's name is not Sovereignty. His name is Ben. It would be a little absurd to run down the street calling for sovereignty, sovereignty. So just to clarify that. And just checking my time. I am going to read a poem called Civilization. What's with these titles, Carl? Musculature, civilization, such a mouthful. Civilization. There's an art to everything. How the rain means April and an ongoingness like that of song until at last it ends. A centuries-old set of silver handbells that once an altar boy swung, processing. You're the same wilderness you've always been, slashing through briars, the bracken of your invasive self. So he said, in a dream. But the rest of it, all the rest, was waking, more often to the next extravagance. Two blackamoor statues, each mirroring the other, each hoisting forever upward his burden of hand-painted, carved by hand peacock feathers. Don't you know it? Don't you know I love you? He said. He was shaking. He said, I love you. There's an art to everything. What I've done with this life, what I'd meant not to do, or would have meant maybe, had I understood, though I have no regrets. Not the broken but still flowering dogwood, not the honey locust either, not even the ghost walnut whose, with its non-branches, whose every shadow is memory, memory. As he said to me once, that's all garbage down the river now. Turning, but as the utterly lost, because addicted do, resigned all over again. It must only look like leaving. There's an art to everything, even turning away. How eventually even hunger can become a space to live in. How they made out of shamelessness something beautiful for as long as they could. All right, I have two more poems left. I always like knowing when I'm in the audience how much I have left. Are there 10 more, 20 more? just two more. This one is rather short. It's called Gold Leaf. So it's sort of an extended fragment. So if you're waiting for a main verb, it's never going to appear, but the fragment will end. Gold leaf. To lift without ever asking what animal exactly it once belonged to, the socketed helmet that what's left of the skull equals, up to your face. To hold it there, mask-like, to look through it until looking through means looking back through the skull, into the self that is partly the animal you've always wanted to be, that, depending, fear has prevented or rescued you from becoming. To know utterly what you'll never be, to understand in doing so what you are, and say no to it, not to who you are, to say no to despair. Seems a good thing to say no to despair if one can. Doesn't always make it go away, but the effort counts. I'll finish with this poem called Fixed Shadow, Moving Water. One friend tells me everything's political. Another says nothing is. We just make it political. By we, he means human beings, I assume. What's political to a fox curled in sleep, or a pond, or a sycamore in winter with no leaves left to stop the snow falling through it? I have loved you for less time than I have loved some others, but none more deeply than you. No one more absolutely, which, as if inevitably, amounts to a hierarchy of sorts, doesn't it? Value, then the power that comes with it. Soon enough, the distribution of power. Who gets to do the distributing? But if we make of tenderness a countervailing force, the two of us, if we can make from tenderness a revolution. Thanks.
Amazing. Amazing.
Nerve-wracking, terrifying.
Oh my gosh, oh wow. I'm so glad you read that poem. I love that poem. I loved all of those poems. But that poem in particular, I feel like sums up so many of the brilliant things that this book does, which is, I feel like this book kind of makes this incredible case for the fact that arguments over hierarchies are arguments about language, and arguments about language are in fact almost always arguments about love in some sense.
Power, I guess.
Yeah, power, and vice versa, of course. Like arguments about love can become arguments about anger, can become arguments about hierarchy. I guess my first question is, like, so many of these poems take the form of like dialogues and argument. There's a sort of call and response in each of the poems. How do you go about negotiating that as just like a form in your work? The argument as form.
The argument as form? See, this is exactly what I was scared of. I thought Brandon's gonna have a smart question. I'm like, what? But I'm gonna try to sound professorial because apparently I am a professor. I mean, in some ways I don't know. What I do know is I do feel as if I believe argument is very important to a poem. But in many ways, I think argument is just an organized way of thinking about our sort of humanly thrashing through conundrum. And so for me, it's not as if I can't write a poem thinking I'm going to write about this and here's the direction I'm going to take. I know many poets who do it that way and sort of almost outline as if they're doing an essay. And for me, it's more like I just want to sort of push into what I can't figure out and start turning it around and looking at a bunch of sides with the understanding for me that I'm never going to get the answer. So it's one of these, it's like a doomed quest. But it's knowing that it's doomed and doing it anyway. It's almost like I don't know, a tragic flaw or something. But I don't know if that's, I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I love that idea of the poem being made and from the exercise of the thinking and the pursuit, right? The sort of
Yeah.
the pursuit becomes the poem, and I had never really thought of that, like of poems as thought and action crystallized somehow.
Yeah, maybe it's like essays, like the original idea of, the Montaigne, however it's said, essay, where it seems as if he always just decided, I'm going to think about this thing, and almost literally walk around thinking about it, but on paper. And that's how I like to write essays, and it's how I think about poetry. Just sort of, instead of thinking, where am I going? What will I discover if I don't have a sense already of where I'm going? And why not be open to that? And I may actually change direction along the way many times, just out of distraction. But to me, distraction is potentially very fruitful. It takes us to the thing we didn't expect to see. And that can often be more interesting than what we had planned to see.
Yeah, there's a poem here, Not Wild, Merely Free, where I feel like it kind of literalizes that idea.
Mm.
There's that part that goes, also that the paths people make over time in parks by departing from the paths actually designated to be walked on are known as desire lanes. And when I came across that, I thought diversion is truth seeking.
Mhm.
Desire is kind of the absence of agency. Like you sort of like accidentally stumble upon what you had been seeking all along, but it's only through the sort of surrendering of agency to chance that you can encounter it.
Yeah,
And that feels
which
like
I think is very counter to how we're told we're supposed to think and even conduct ourselves intellectually, but also bodily. And I get it. I mean, self-protection means you should sort of think about what you're doing, where you're going,
Mhm.
but maybe something like self-revelation happens once you stop, when you let your guard down, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it also occurs to me that this is maybe the difference between, revelation and fact finding, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
like this idea, what is going on outdoors?
You live in New York City.
I know, what a nightmare. But this idea that people think that like revelation and facts are both like shades of truth, and like maybe that is true, but I feel like revelation is, there's a sense that like it kind of unmasks you, like it sneaks up on you in some way. A revelation, you can never quite see a revelation coming.
No, I mean, I think vaguely from what I think about its Latin base, revelation is in a sense to be uncovered, to sort of be unveiled. And so, and not by plan, but you're sort of moving along and then suddenly you realize you're naked. Or some aspect of the world is naked and you suddenly see it in an entirely different way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I felt very revealed by these poems. In fact, I have a question about the making of the book. So, the first phase of the book, the then the war section, is
Mhm.
a collection of new and newer work, and then you have the selected portion. I'm curious about how you negotiated putting together these two corpora of your work, like the
Yeah.
sort of the new stuff and the older stuff, and when you're putting together a selected volume, like what are some of the considerations that you have when you're sort of piecing it together?
Well, thanks for that and all these questions. Well, the first part, and the people at Carcanet may have to check me for accuracy, um, because it all kind of came about in a very random way. I had written a book called Then the War, which is the new poems in the book. I turned that book in and it had been taken by my publisher here in the United States. And so I was all set. And then one day I was walking my dog and there's a message from my publisher saying, Carcanet over in England would like to do a book of yours, some kind of way of introducing you, maybe a selection of poems. And I thought, that's great. And and then the publisher started saying, yeah, maybe we should do Selected here too at the same time instead of Then the War. Like we could do that later. And I started panicking, like, well, and plus I'm very opposed to selected and especially to new and selected poems in general, because usually it's just like 12 new poems and then a bunch of old stuff. It always feels like someone's, trying to buy time. And so I said, what if we just put the two together, a selected and this whole full book? And the publisher here thought that was great. And when they presented to Carcanet, they were excited about it. So, but the first thing I said was, okay, but it can't say new and selected on the front. And the publisher here in the States was insistent that, oh no, it has to be new and selected. And so there's this battle back and forth forever. And I finally got them to do and instead of new and selected, just the title and then and. And then I made a big thing of, I want Then the War to be in big print, as it is, and then just in little print, the and selected poems, so people would see it's just a. So that was more like a packaging situation. But then came the issue of, he said, well, how soon can you get me the selected poems? And I was afraid Carcanet would disappear, because I've wanted for decades to be published in the UK. And so I thought, I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning. And I went through the books, and as I tend to put books together anyway, I did it very intuitively, kind of. I drink a lot of wine, and I took an edible, and I sort of sit there and I thought, you seem right, you seem right, you seem right. And the idea I had in my mind was, I wanted to have maybe just 8 to 10 from each of the books that would, on one hand, give you a pretty good skeleton of what the book had been that it came from, but that these poems wouldn't require that larger context. They could stand on their own. And so it would, in a sense, be a tightening of focus. And by the next morning, I was pretty much done. I mean, I looked and I thought, okay, maybe not that one, or, there was slight rearrangement, but I trust my instincts about this. And I don't like to think, I write poems in the same way. If I take too long to think, that I'll start realizing I'm writing a poem, and then I can't write it. So hence, that's why the wine helped a little bit too.
Yeah,
that was a long answer.
No, it's a perfect. I mean, and it sort of dovetails with what we were talking about earlier. Instinct,
Yeah.
feeling, the revelation. Yeah. It has to find you, not the other way around.
It does. Although I tell my students, I don't want my students to think they should go home and like drink and do drugs or something. But allowing your mind to sort of wander freely, and it's why I think for me, my best ideas come to me when I'm doing something sort of mindless, like walking a dog or peeling vegetables. I'm not focused on that. So my mind sort of wanders vaguely, and often lines come that way.
Yeah. I often find also back pressure, just like doing something that you can just be loose up here.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was working as a scientist, all those days pipetting at my bench, I had so many great ideas. Haven't had an idea since. Maybe I should go back.
I think you've got a lot of ideas going, Brandon.
Well, that's very generous of you. Well, so now, okay, so then you made the selections. I'm curious if like having all of it selected and lined up like this, I'm curious if you've noticed any changes or any developments, or if you've noticed certain themes emerge and recede over your collections.
I mean, on the worst days, I think, oh, aren't these just the further adventures of Carl? It's like, is there anything new? But on other days, and they probably are still that way. But what I do notice is I think I have a fairly limited number of themes, though I like to think that, that's also something I could say is true of Emily Dickinson. But if you have large enough themes like desire, eros, the body, mortality. But what I did notice in seeing it all together is the passage of time, in the sense of, I'm 62 years old. And so, the way that I think about the body and about love is going to be different, of course, from how I thought of it at 30. And also that's one of the stranger things was to see, I can privately track the relationships in my life that were going on at the time. And I realized, oh, okay, that was back then. I needed to go through that situation, which was kind of disastrous, but useful in certain ways. And so yeah, I guess I feel when I look at the new poems, I feel like, oh, you've made it into your 60s, Carl, and you're relatively stable, but just enough unhinged to still be able to keep writing for a while. We'll see.
One of the things that I found most moving, because it is selected, I was able to sort of go back and read the earlier books and then track how those themes had sort of cropped up in Then the War. And one of the things that, I mean, you've always been very frank in your work about the body, about sex, about desire. But something that I found like really striking is the directness with which you write about love and intimacy and a desire for love. And so many of the poems in Then the War, you're turning over love and what it means to be in love and the sort of like strange things you recognize about yourself now that one is in love. Like there's such a directness in talking about love in a way that some of the earlier poems were you know feistier when it feistier on the subject of love. I'm curious if that's something that you felt when you were sort of putting this together, the sort of evolution of love in the work of Carl Phillips.
Yeah, I mean, this maybe ties in with what I said about the relationships. I mean, I can say that to me, the relationship that is the crowning relationship of my life and in my mind is going to last the rest of my life began around the time of Wild Was the Wind.
Mm.
And so, and I've noticed that the poems have shifted in some way. They're less about dissatisfaction or a restlessness of a certain kind. And they're more about sort of examining the thing that from the start, I think what got me starting to write way back in the 80s was wondering, is it even possible for two men to make a life together that is stable? There weren't many examples in my life of that or in the media. And and I've made my various attempts to create that, but it's taken a while to find the maturity for myself that enabled me to have a kind of relationship that could be less turbulent. And so I think the turbulence is what is less there now. And there's more of an addressing something that doesn't seem, I think sometimes people think to write about love is a little cheesy or,
Yes.
Overused. And I think I've felt that way too. But then now I think, well, I mean, of course, love is a real thing. But I don't want to treat it sentimentally or, love is a real thing, but it's always potentially under siege as well. There's still the erotic pull, and there's still just the difficulty of any two sensibilities coming together for any period of time in a peaceful way. So yeah, sometimes it feels like just looking at a photo album and thinking, there you are, Carl, you still recognize yourself, but aren't you glad you're not that spindly 5-year-old? But on the other hand, the 5-year-old had a lot of hair and this one doesn't, but you don't have hair, but you're not as sort of fucked up. So, but you're fucked up enough to keep yourself interesting.
Yeah, I love that.
I mean, I think the most interesting people are a little fucked up. So
certainly that appears to be the case for poets. I mean, the poets I love, they're all just unwell.
I mean, some of them are just overly neurotic and self-involved. Yes. There's that. But I mean, having a genuine kind of weird ripple through a ripple of weirdness seems important.
Yeah. So the other thing, and related to that, is the other sort of big theme that was especially present in Then the War, and that feels like a kind of maturation of one of your subjects, is the idea, like your work is full of these localities that exist outside of some dominant gaze, like these spaces where you're trying to figure out, like, how can two men exist in relation to each other, external to all of society's pressures and whatnot. And I feel like, especially in Among Trees, where you like really literalize that, where you're sort of literally thinking about trees and gardens and the book is filled with the sort of Edenic isolation. I'm curious about your fascination with these enclosed places, both as sites of cruising, sites of eros, and also sites of agape, sites of love and intimacy and togetherness.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have anything sophisticated to say about it. It just well, first of all, place is very important to me. And I think the reason place is so important is because I grew up moving almost every year of my childhood. My father was in the Air Force and the family was moved around a lot. And I think it made me, when we didn't settle into one place until I was in high school in Massachusetts. So I think that instability and place have been very linked to me. And in place of it, I think I have an impulse to want to create a space that I can control and that I can hide in and be myself in some way. And and so that's just place in general. These natural spaces, I don't know, I guess maybe it's just a sensibility or an affinity. I mean, some people hate being in the woods and find it frightening. I kind of, I think, and I write about this a bit in that sort of prose passage thing that's in there, that sometimes I think it's has to do with all the reading I did as a kid. Sometimes I feel as if in my head, I live in some world that's not even this world, where people have falconry going on, and there's and you run into strangers and they actually turn out to be okay, as opposed to what we're told really happens in the woods, and you could be kidnapped, you could be killed, whatever. So I don't know. I have a vexed relationship to space, and part of it, I think, maybe is just having felt marginalized for a number of reasons throughout my growing up. I think it's made me feel as if, okay, well then I'll just shape a private space that I can reliably return to whenever I want to. And part of that is in one's head, but I think it's also been what I've been writing all this time, sort of fleshing out this sort of confined landscape, psychological, emotional landscape, I suppose, that allows me and a handful of people to sort of live honestly. And then, then you open the door and go out into the real world and you think, oh, right, that's right, I forgot. But at least I have it to come back to.
Yeah. And another thing that happens again and again in these poems is that, there are places in the poems, being among the trees, there are gardens, there are fields. You love a field, there are fields of plenty. And then there are these like beautiful moments where bodies also become a place and bodies become containers, bodies become texts to be read, and so there is like this really amazing collapsing of place and haven and container and vessel and body all together, and this like incredible, I mean, I found it virtuosic, like all the ways that like the body becomes a destination, even where one finds safety or one finds violence or one finds pain or struggle or strife. And it's incredible, it's amazing.
It's a weird way to think about sex, because then penetration becomes exploration, or becomes, to enter a landscape and to enter a body are two very different things, but both entail some risk. And then, we usually think of entering a landscape as opposed to a landscape entering us, but in a bodily situation, one can be penetrated. And so what's required for that, and what kind of vulnerability, but it seems related to the vulnerability that's also involved in entering a strange space that's a physical landscape. So, and yet, how will we ever know what's in there if we don't go in? So, I don't know. And there are some people who would say, that's okay, I don't need to know what's in there. And I think that's most people, actually. And that's fine. That's probably for the best for society. But there have to be a few people who say, yeah, but I just want to look under that rock. I want to go in that space.
Yeah, crack the
Leave
book
the
open.
path.
Have a look.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not gonna monopolize you any longer. Let's get some audience questions in here. This one is from Nancy Ann Miller. Your work has a quietness and a smoothness to it. The edges are worn down like when being like when being in an in-depth long-term relationship, a lot of details have merged into a oneness. Is this intended as a reflection of a good working relationship?
Huh. That's an interesting question. Um, I mean, I want to say it isn't, but then I'm not sure. I was just thinking, do I do that? The edges being, is that how it was phrased? That the edges seem smoothed away?
Mm-hmm. Smooth down.
Yeah, smooth down, which is, I guess, different from smooth away. I mean, maybe it is. At least, maybe that's true of the new poems in here. Because a poem that's older, like that foliage one, that that comes out of a very different time in my life, and from a that comes from a relationship that was actually a violent relationship. Uh, uh, that that seems a harder edged poem, I suppose one could say. Whereas a poem that's much more reflective of where I am now is the one I finished with, the fixed shadow moving water, that to me doesn't have that same. It has landscape, it has difficulty, but it does seem as if maybe that's a poem where the edges are smooth more. And maybe that is reflective of of being in something that's more workable.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
like that question because it's now provoking me to think more about it beyond this session. I will do so.
I mean, I think it's one of the great benefits of having a collected volume like this is that you get to wonder and ponder such questions. I do sometimes
Yeah.
worry for the speakers of those earlier poems. I do sometimes worry for those speakers.
I know. I mean, they're kind of reckless. So
They're
reckless and dangerous.
they are doing things.
Yeah.
um,
But you can't live that way all your life. So, it's kind of like maybe I'm just a late bloomer. And so, in my 40s, I was more like how people are supposed to be in their 20s. I don't know.
mm.
Which puts me where now? I'm in my 60s, so I'm in my 40s. That seems about right.
That tracks. I mean, you're ageless to me, Carl. You'll always
Uh-huh.
be 25 to me.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
this is from Adam. Carl, you read your line ends beautifully. Your little pauses seem of a piece with the poem's other enactments of hesitation and revision.
Mhm.
To what extent do you notice the verse form interfering with the prose argument as you write and read? Ooh, I like that question.
I do too. To what extent I find the verse form arguing with the prose?
Interfering with the prose argument as you write or read.
Well, I don't find it interfering. What I'm interested in is how the two, I feel as if successful poems always have points of resistance. And so I like the idea of the the argument that could be written out as prose and would have one kind of meaning, but divided in a very controlled way. It suggests that there's forward movement, but we're not allowed to see it except in measured portions that we ourselves don't get to measure. Only the poet gets to do that. And to me, that's one of my most exciting, the thing that most excites me about writing poems is the tension between the sentence and the line. I feel as if many poets, think the same, they're the same thing, but they're not. I mean, Shakespeare's Sonnet 129, at least in the version I have, is two sentences. One sentence is 12 lines long, and then the second sentence is 2 lines long. And there's so much being said about volume and proportion in and when you look at what the 12-line sentence says, it basically says lust is a really terrible thing. And then the last 2 lines say, yeah, everyone knows that, but no one knows what to do about it. And so even in that distribution, the argument sort of says, okay, the world is 80% lust and 20% reason, or helplessness, the helplessness of reason. And to me, that happens because the argument's been measured out in a certain way.
Mm.
So I don't know. I hope that answered that question.
Oh, I also just want to give a shout out to your pauses, your commas, your use of punctuation, your semicolons.
Well, I mean, I love punctuation. Though you should see the eye roll I get from my students when I just last week, and we're going to be talking about it this afternoon too, because someone again used a comma, and I don't understand what they think a comma is for. And then when I talk about it, let's talk about what a comma is for, the eye roll happens. But it matters, and I feel as if punctuation to me is like musical notation. The pause of a comma is different from a semicolon, is different from a colon, is different from a period. And so what psychologically and emotionally can be conveyed by those different pauses, they're strategies for control. And to me, a poem is all about power and control and release of it. But the writer gets to determine when to release the reader, when to restrain them. And punctuation is huge in the work that it does.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's
I was
crucial.
going to say, I'm saying this to you, you know this.
I mean, it's yes, you have some of the best commas in the business. This is this is from John Greening, and we've had a few people ask similar questions, so I'll just bundle them all up here. British and American poets don't seem to be as aware of each other as they once were. Are there any particular UK writers who have contributed to your development? And feel free to use this to talk about UK writers or poets in general who have contributed to your work or influenced you.
Oh, like contemporary ones? I assume that's what's meant.
Sure.
Not Shakespeare or something.
I mean, yeah, he's in the
Not
air.
Wordsworth. So yes, no, I mean, it's interesting. There are many. I agree. First of all, there doesn't seem to be the same exchange sometimes as I thought there used to be. But I don't know. I find writers and then I stay with them for a while, and so for a very long time at this point, I've been very caught up in the work of Alice Oswald, and there's someone who we write in utterly different ways, but I'm fascinated with talking about landscape, the way landscape sort of takes on voice, and I don't know, her poems seem to enact rivers, landscapes in general, water spaces. So there's that. And then there are poets whom I don't necessarily feel I understand. But I reread them all the time, like Elaine Aquilinoin, an Irish poet, Maeve McGuckian. These are some of them are poets who were introduced to me by colleagues here at my university, one of whom used to work at, or I think oversee, Wake Forest Press, a press that still brings a lot of contemporary Irish poetry over here and publishes it. So those are some, but I will say a lot, they're not contemporary anymore, though I feel like they're only recently dead. When I first started writing in college, I very much was under the spell of Ted Hughes, and read every single thing over and over, long before I knew that there was a connection between him and Sylvia Plath, actually. And another person whom I was fortunate to later befriend is Tom Gunn, and whose work really opened up for me, the work and the man himself opened up possibilities for how desire can be reckoned with in poetry. And he begins as such an elegant formalist, and to see how that gets sort of transformed through and partly his coming over here and living in San Francisco and everything, but he still was very much to me an English poet. I don't know, he's been very important to me and still is. So those are some. I don't know, and I don't know how it works over there. I mean, I sometimes think maybe there are a handful of American poets known over there, but maybe I'm wrong about it. I'll have to come over and see.
Yes, bring Carl over on a fact-finding mission. I must know. I mean, poets are all just magical people to me. I have no idea what y'all are ever doing. Even the American poets. I sometimes listen to my poet friends talk, and I'm like, wow, that is a different world.
It's something. I don't know. Strangely enough, I tend not to spend a lot of time around poets in actual real life. I don't know.
Maybe there's like a sort of mutual species aversion because all my friends are poets. Like most of
Hmm.
my like real closest, like Garth and Derek Austin and
Mhm,
Natasha
mhm.
Lotta-Kuhn, Jay Dot. Like these are all people who are my closest friends. But I don't know that many like fiction writer. I mean, Garth is a fiction writer, but he was a
Yeah,
poet first.
yeah.
And yeah, I maybe you just can't hang out with your own species. Maybe there's a thing there. I'm curious about this question, so I'm going to ask it. Carl, your poems have a variety of shapes. How do you arrive at those shapes? And is the look of the poem on the page important to you?
Oh, it's crucial to me. I feel as if the poem isn't right until it's found its form. And um, I think of myself as, I mean, in terms of when it comes to the argument of a poem, I sometimes feel as if I'm building something in layers. But when it comes to the form, it's more like, because when I write, I tend to write in a big, what would look to anyone else like a page of prose. And then I go through, sort of cutting lines through where I feel like I hear a pause. So in that sense, it feels like sculpting, having something large that needs to be now made into a shape. And it's not until that's when I'll often know that I've got all the right words and they're all in the right order, but this isn't how it's supposed to look. This is another thing that makes my students roll their eyes at me, because I'll ask something simple like, can you tell me why this poem is in couplets? And you'd be amazed how many people will burst into tears at this simple question. Um, I say, there's no right or wrong answer. Just why did you choose that? And it's like, I don't know. It just happened. Tears. But I do feel as if that's a really important, to me, it's everything. And otherwise we just have ideas floating around. But to me, the poem, the shape of the poem should enact what we're talking about. So I want the journey through the poem to make the reader feel what it feels like to have lived inside whatever these ideas were. And if I can get the right shape, and if the reader will pause in the way I'm trying to get them to, then I hope that will happen. Yeah, form seems pretty important to me, but I feel as if it's less and less important these days. And I don't know. I mean, I have some ideas of why that may be, but it's as if, I don't know. I think there's more, it seems more scattershot now.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I look at it, I love the array of shapes a poem can have. I'm not always sure what it means, but I love looking at some poems. But in your work, I mean, reading through these poems, I felt like there was such a strong, firm hand guiding me through the poems, and that came from the shape, but also just from, as you say, the form, the punctuation. It felt like there was such a strong current to read it a certain way. It felt almost like the poem had its own gravitational field and it was working on
Yeah.
me as I was reading them. And I don't know, I found that kind of arresting.
Yeah, I think when you see a poem, I like looking at a poem before I've even read it. Like
Mm-hmm.
if I see a poem that's in a long, thin column, I know that it's going to be a sort of a certain kind of journey. I'm going to get little chunks of information and move steadily down the page. If I see really long lines, already there's a density to it, and so I go in expecting something. It's almost like seeing a thicket versus seeing a little hedge of forsythia where you can see the sunlight through it. And so there's some, you have different expectations based on the form. But that's true in fiction too, it seems to me. And often I think, why is this called a novel when it's 80 pages? Why is it not a novella? Why is this 200-page thing called a short story? I don't know.
Yeah. Questions for Alice Munro. We've got a she's
Exactly.
notorious for that. Okay, this is the last question. I wanted to squeeze this one in. We have a question from a terrified teenage poet in a tiny English town for you to answer. This is from Leo Beavers. Firstly, thank you so much for this. It's been unreservedly magical. Secondly, this is a painfully simple and cliche question, but I had to try. Do you have any advice for poets just starting out?
I do, but I I'm worried that it's going to seem obvious, but I mean it what I'm going to say. I think the main thing is, and everyone says this, but is to read as widely as possible, and not just poetry, anything you're interested in, because just to me, the most important thing is to get to a point where you're living in language and it feels natural. So some people would say write every day. I don't think that could be good if you're the kind of person who writes every day. I'm not, but I feel like every day I make a point of reading. I read 3 or 4 hours every night, and just always have. But also it doesn't have to be a big Russian novel. It could be a magazine, or, I don't know, something simple. Because to me, you're watching how other people have deployed language and to convey meaning. And that's what you want to take on for yourself. So it all counts. And if someone, and I would say, don't listen to people if they say, why are you reading that, comic book? A thing I love, actually. I read a lot of comic books. I guess we call them graphic novels now, but they're comic books to me. But comic books are where I learned so much about interaction between different kinds of people when I was a kid. So yeah, I guess I would say that. And also, just if there's something that you gravitate towards, that you're interested in thinking and writing about, then do so, no matter what other people say. Because I think the most interesting kinds of thinking often seem suspicious to outsiders, and or suspicious to the world. And so you feel like an outsider, but it means that you have something unique to bring to the page eventually. I hope you become less terrified. And I was going to say, and I hope you leave your tiny town, but actually the idea of living in a tiny town is thrilling to me.
Same. What is it about?
But it wasn't when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager, I was bored being in a tiny town. So.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I turned 30 and all I want to do is go back to a tiny town and never leave.
But now you live in New York City.
I know, and it's lovely. New York is kind of a village now anyway. Like, if you get in the right neighborhood, it can feel like a village. It can feel like its own little...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna take your word for it.
Well, amazing. Thank you for this, Carl. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for doing this. Thanks everyone for the questions. Thank you, Brandon. I don't know what we do now. Do we just disappear, or does someone lead us? Oh, Jasmine is back on the screen.
Amazing.
Don't just disappear. I just want to say thank you so much to both of you. I really did not want this to end. It's been an absolute privilege to hear you read, Carl, and thank you so much, Brandon, for your questions and for hosting this evening. Honestly, I have had such an excellent night, so thank you both so much. Thank you all for being here. It's been fucking fantastic. Sorry, don't swear. I'm putting the link in the chat. Go and buy the book. Thank you for paying your £2. Please use your discount. Buy the book for all your friends and your enemies and for absolutely everybody that you know. Thank you so much. Congratulations, Carl.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Please join us again next week. We are launching Alison Brackenbury's new collection, Thorpe Nets. It's on Wednesday, the 2nd of March. We're going to be joined by David Clark, and I'm putting that link in the chat for you as well. So really, that's everything for us. I'm going to turn our cameras off now, but I'm going to leave the chat open so you can get your last messages in there. Let us know what you thought, and then go and buy the book. So thank you all so much, and good night from us.
See you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.